with the swirling, flaming sword blocking their way back, with the majestic figures of the cherubim standing as an eternal barrier, Adam and Eve's world, a garden filled with divine light and harmonious music, suddenly plunged into a vast, silent wilderness. They were naked not only physically, but also souls stripped of their innocence and glory. For the first time, the wind blew with a biting chill, and for the first time, the earth responded to their footsteps with a hard, rough texture. They were expelled from the Garden of Eden, but the memory of it, like an unhealed wound, etched itself into their lives for nearly 1,000 years. Those first days were filled with utter confusion and fear. In the Garden of Eden, hunger was a non-existent concept, and fruit was always readily available at the perfect time. But now the emptiness in their stomachs was a real, painful torment. For the first time, Adam realized that survival required planning. He clumsily discerned which wild fruits were edible and which plants harbored hidden poisonous thorns. He saw wild beasts stalking the night. The creatures he once shared peacefully with now gleamed with a strange, terrifying light in their eyes. He built his first crude shelter of stones and branches, not just to protect against the wind and rain, but also to ward off the boundless loneliness and insecurity deep within. Eve, on the other hand, experienced a different kind of pain unprecedented in her experience. She watched the sweat drip from Adam's forehead, his hands scratched by thorns, and her heart was filled with self-blame and regret. The judgment, "By the sweat of your brow you shall eat your bread," was no longer a distant echo, but the harshest reality before her. She too learned to work, gathering edible roots and processing animal hides with a smooth stone, the leather garments God made for them, while masking the shame of their bodies, were also a constant reminder that lives had ended because of their transgressions. This was the first death they witnessed, a blessing, but also a heavy symbol. Their conversations grew less frequent, yet more burdensome. At first, they would accuse each other. Adam would say, "If you had not listened to the serpent," Eve would retort, "if you had not refused," but such words would only deepen their wounds. They were the only two people on the land, each other's only comfort. On countless cold nights, they could only hold each other tightly, seeking a lingering warmth in each other's body heat. They began to understand that they were expelled together and would bear the consequences together. From that moment on, their fates were bound together in a new and bitter way. They still prayed to God, but in a completely different way. In the Garden of Eden, walking with God was a stroll in the cool evening breeze, an intimate conversation. Now their prayers were more like cries in the wilderness, filled with awe, alienation, and a hint of uncertain longing. They would build simple altars and offer a portion of their labors, not in exchange for anything, but as an instinctive remembrance and confession. They gazed up at the stars, trying to find the familiar gaze of God within the vast expanse of the heavens, but most of the time, they were met only by the silent stars and the whistling of the wind. Then Cain was born. After enduring the personal judgment of the pains of childbirth, Eve held the newborn, and for the first time, her eyes were kindled. She said to Adam, "I have found a man." This was more than a mother's joy, it was a profound hope. Perhaps this child was the beginning of hope. Perhaps in some way he could atone for their sins. They gave Cain their best, teaching him to farm and to know the land. Then Abel came into the world. Unlike his brothers, Abel was quiet, enjoying the company of sheep. He had heard from his parents about the Garden of Eden and the Creator. He seemed to have a natural affinity for the invisible God. Adam and Eve watched their two sons grow up, filled with mixed feelings. They were the future of humanity, the continuation of life. But this also meant that the perfect world they had lost became, for them, a distant story, not a personal experience. That day became the darkest in Adam and Eve's lives, even darker than their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. They likely watched from afar as Cain and Abel offered their sacrifices. They saw God accept Abel's offering and saw the sullen anger on Cain's face. They might have considered stepping forward to dissuade him, but they had no idea the seeds of sin would sprout and bear such hideous fruit. When they found Abel's cold body in the field, Eve let out a heartbreaking cry. It was the first time she had witnessed the death of a human being, the son she had so deeply cherished. Adam knelt silently, stroking Abel's young face with trembling hands. He finally understood the full weight of the words, "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." This was not just his own fate, but the fate of all his descendants. The sin he had introduced into the world now consumed his very flesh and blood. That day Adam's back became even more hunched, as if he had aged hundreds of years in an instant. And Cain, their once beloved eldest son, bore the curse and mark of God, leaving them forever, wandering far and wide. Adam and Eve lost two sons in a single day. Their home, a place so painstakingly built in the wilderness, so full of hope, suddenly became empty and silent. Regret, like a venom, ate away at their very core. They realized they had lost not only the Garden of Eden but also their own innocence. Sin had spread from their own children to the next generation, manifesting itself in an even more violent and direct way. In their prolonged sorrow, they had nearly lost all hope, until Eve conceived again and gave birth to Seth. Holding the child, she cried, "God has given me another son in place of Abel, because Cain killed him." For them, Seth's birth was more than just the birth of another son. It was a sign of God's mercy. Like a glimmer of light, it pierced the shadow of death that hung over their hearts. Seth, meaning set up or replacement, his very existence was a promise from God. Proof that God had not completely abandoned them. From then on, Adam and Eve's lives entered a new phase. They were no longer simply a couple toiling for survival. They became the guardians and transmitters of human history. Gathering Seth and their subsequent children around them, they recounted the story of the lost paradise over and over again. Their accounts were filled with detail and emotion. Adam would describe the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the gleaming rivers, and the warm sunshine that afternoon when he named all the animals. His voice was filled with unconcealed longing and sorrow. Eve would add that the flowers in the garden never withered, the air was always filled with fragrance, and the peace and joy that came from walking with God. But they didn't just talk about the good. They also spoke openly of their own rebellion. They would describe in detail the serpent's cunning words, how their hearts were swayed by pride and lust, and the shame and fear they felt when their eyes opened the moment they ate the forbidden fruit. They told their children how sin entered the world and how heavy the price of sin was. Abel's death became the most painful and profound example in their teaching. Most importantly, at the end of their stories, they always mentioned the small but firm promise woven into the midst of judgment, the seed of the woman shall bruise the serpent's head, and the serpent shall bruise his heel. At first, they might not fully understand the full meaning of these words, but as the years passed, and their understanding of God's justice and love deepened, this promise became the anchor of their entire hope. They told their children that despite humanity's failure, God had already provided a way of redemption. A seed of the woman would come, and he would endure wounds, but he would ultimately triumph over the original tempter and shatter the power of sin. Adam and Eve became humanity's first teachers, and their home became the first seminary. They taught their children how to build altars and offer sacrifices, and how to call upon God's name with reverence. When Seth's son Enosh was born, the Bible records that at that time men began to call upon the name of the Lord. This doesn't mean that prayer hadn't existed before, but rather that, under Seth's lineage, humanity began to develop a tradition of public communal worship. Behind this, undoubtedly lay the faith and wisdom of Adam and Eve, honed over centuries. Time had left its mark on them. Their skin was wrinkled like the soil they had tilled 1,000 times. Their hair turned white, like the snow on a winter mountaintop. They lived long enough to see their descendants multiply and become a vast nation. They witnessed the formation of villages, the development of skills, and the corruption of human hearts. They heard of Lamech, a descendant of Cain, the maniac who married two wives and boasted of his murderous vengeance. They witnessed firsthand how the world simultaneously drifted in two directions. One, the path of seeking God, represented by Seth; the other, the path of self-reliance and violence, represented by Cain. In their later years, Adam often sat alone on a hillside, gazing eastward. He gazed not at the sunrise, but toward the Garden of Eden, to which he could never return. No longer filled with the resentment and pain of his youth, his gaze grew deep and calm. His life was one of transition from perfection to brokenness, and from brokenness, learning trust. He understood that true home lay not in the physical garden, but in restoring his lost relationship with God. He knew he could never return to Eden, but he believed that through the promise of the seed of the woman, his descendants would one day enter a homeland even more beautiful than Eden. Eve, in turn, became the mother of all living for countless generations. She used her own experience to comfort women suffering in childbirth, and her wisdom to guide young mothers. She watched generation after generation of new lives being born and growing before her eyes, knowing that each child bore both the image of God and the nature of sin. Her heart was filled with love, concern, and a long prayer. She prayed for each generation of her descendants, hoping they would follow Seth's path, clinging to their fear of God and their hope in the promise of redemption. Adam lived to be 930 years old. In his final moments, he perhaps summoned Seth and his descendants. His voice, once the voice that named all things, was now faint, yet still full of power. He told the story of Eden for the last time, and emphasized the promise of the woman's offspring for the last time. He looked at his descendants, perhaps with tears in his eyes, but more often with a sense of peace after entrusting them. He closed his eyes, and his body returned to dust, just as God had commanded. His passing marked the first complete natural death in human history, the end of an era. Eve lived alone for several more years after Adam's departure. As the oldest mother in human history, she continued to guard the flame of faith. Ultimately, she too passed away peacefully. Her life journey ranged from the joy of being created, to the regret of being deceived, to the hope of becoming a mother, and finally, over the long years, to becoming a guardian of faith. Adam and Eve's final years were marked by no earth-shattering feats, no historic achievements. Their lives were filled with the most basic elements of humanity: labor, childbirth, family, sorrow, joy, and death. Yet, it was during these seemingly ordinary millennia that they fulfilled their ultimate destiny. They went from the lost to the watchers, from the rebels to the teachers. They spent their lives explaining to future generations the heavy price of sin, and with all their remaining strength, they passed on the small but unquenchable light of God's promise. Though expelled from the Garden of Eden, they laid the first cornerstone of human faith in the wilderness. Their story began with failure in a garden but ended in the hope of a future Redeemer. Their final years are a long and profound poem. The poem is filled with sweat, tears, and toil, yet a single theme resonates throughout, even in a land of exile. God's grace and mercy quietly work in unimaginable ways, preparing a way home for a lost world. If you have been inspired by today's sharing, moved by Adam and Eve's perseverance and hope in the face of loss, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. Please also share this story of humanity's initial struggle and hope with those around you. Let us explore together the faith, hope, and love that permeate history. How did Adam and Eve spend their final years after being expelled from the Garden of Eden? When the swirling, flaming sword blocked the path to the tree of life behind them, Adam and Eve's world instantly plunged from eternal light into the shadow of time. There not only were their bodies, but also their souls, once intimate with their Creator. The gates of Eden slammed shut behind them, a sound that echoed day and night for nearly 1,000 years thereafter. They set foot on a completely unfamiliar land, The sun here no longer caressed them gently but scorched them. The cool night breeze no longer sang a gentle lullaby, but was a biting cold. In the Garden of Eden, fruit was readily available, but here every grain of wheat that filled their stomachs was watered with sweat and earned with toil. The thorns and thistles on the ground seemed like a silent accusation of the earth's betrayal. Every prick of Adam's hand reminded him of the heavy judgment. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your bread. The first days were long nights woven with fear and regret. They learned to cover themselves with animal skins, and the lingering warmth of the fur gave them their first direct experience of the coldness of death. To obtain this clothing, a life was lost. This was the first price of their sin, visible and tangible. Helpless in their crude shelters of branches and mud, they listened to the distant howls of wild beasts, a sound filled with threat and hunger they had never heard before. They hugged each other tightly, but they could never find the pure, unadulterated warmth they had in the Garden of Eden. Eve's tears often soaked Adam's shoulders, and she would ask over and over again, "Adam, can we go back?" Adam could not answer. He could only look up at the starry sky, which seemed identical to the one above the Garden of Eden, but now he felt an unbridgeable chasm between him and the God who walked with him in the garden. He began to call out to God, but all he received in response was the wind and his own echo. The conversation that had once been as natural as breathing now became a gaze and wait that required immense faith. He began to build an altar, offering a portion of his labors. This was not an exchange, but an instinctive remembrance, a longing for loss, a clinging to the promise. Laced with judgment and a glimmer of hope, the seed of the woman shall bruise your head. Eve's pain was more concrete and cyclical. When she conceived her first child, the joy of creating the new life was quickly overwhelmed by unprecedented pain. The words of judgment were fulfilled in her body. I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. Each heart-wrenching contraction was a harsh reminder of that afternoon when she reached out and plucked the forbidden fruit. Yet, when Cain's first cry pierced the silence, Eve, holding this soft, warm little life, felt her tears mingled with joy for the first time. She looked at him and said to Adam, I have found a man. Perhaps, in her heart, this new life was the beginning of the promise, the hope of breaking the serpent's curse. They told Cain and Abel, who was born later, all about the Garden of Eden. They described the light, the river, the harmony, and the loving and just Creator. Their childhood stories were not myths learned at their grandparents' knees, but the beginning of human history, lessons learned through their parents' own personal experience. Adam taught them to farm, to shepherd, and, more importantly, how to worship the invisible God. He told them that, though cast out, God still watched over them, and that their sacrifices were a sign of their repentance and faith. However, they soon discovered that once the knowledge of good and evil was unlocked, it was like a flood that could never be reversed. This knowledge manifested itself in their children in a more sinister way than they had anticipated. They saw in Cain's eyes a jealousy of Abel's favor with God, a shadow they had never seen in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve might have tried to mediate, using their own painful experience to reassure their eldest son, telling him that jealousy is the whisper of a serpent, a path to deeper darkness. But tragedy struck nonetheless. That day Abel did not return with his flock as usual. An unsettling silence hung in the air. A sense of foreboding gripped Adam and Eve, and they called out their sons' names as they crossed the fields. Then they saw it. In the field Abel lay in a pool of blood, his blood as red as the whiteness of the lamb he had offered to God. It was the first time humans had witnessed murder, and the victim was their son, murdered by another of their sons. Eve's cry of grief foreshadowed the heartbreak of every mother in a sin-tainted world. She held Abel's cooling body, the pain 1,000 times greater than that of childbirth. Adam knelt on the ground, his hands trembling as he scooped up a handful of blood-stained soil. This was death, not the death of an animal, not an abstract concept, but the life of his own son, ended by the hands of his other son. In that moment, he truly and completely understood the full meaning of "in the day you eat of it you will surely die." Death is not just the demise of the body, it is the severance of relationships, the distortion of love, and the propagation of sin. When God confronted Cain, marked him, and sent him wandering, Adam and Eve's hearts were torn again. They had lost Abel forever, they had also lost Cain, who would live in cursed fear, isolated and alone from his family. A family, thus shattered. The loss of Eden was the first exile, and Cain's departure was the second, an even more heartbreaking exile within the family. In the endless sorrow, Adam and Eve's life seemed frozen. They worked, ate, and slept, but the light of life seemed extinguished with Abel's death. They would sit side by side on the hillside, silently watching the sunset. The scene might have been beautiful, but in their eyes, it reflected only endless loss. They would remember the twilight of the Garden of Eden, when God walked with them. Now, they could only lean on each other for warmth amidst the vast emptiness. Yet, God had not forgotten his promise. When Adam was 130 years old, Eve gave birth to another son. She named him Seth, meaning, God has appointed me another son in place of Abel. Seth's birth was like the first ray of sunshine after a long, dark reign. He was not a replacement for Abel, but a continuation of hope. His arrival made Adam and Eve realize that even though sin brought death and separation, God's grace and plan continued to move forward. The thread of the promise of the woman's offspring was not broken by Cain's sin, but would continue to be woven through Seth's line. From then on, Adam and Eve entered a new phase in their lives. No longer merely outcasts struggling for survival, they became the guardians and teachers of human history. Their home became humanity's first classroom and temple. Over the next 800 years, they watched Seth's descendants multiply and flourish. They became the forefathers of a vast family, living legends. Imagine the scene. By a dusky campfire, Adam, his hair white, his face etched with the ravages of 900 years, recounting to his great-grandchildren the beginnings of the world. His voice might have cracked, but his eyes would sparkle again as he described the Garden of Eden. He would tell them that man was not created for toil and death. He would describe the sweetness of speaking face to face with God, with the deepest poignancy. He would recount the serpent's lie and how their moment of disobedience had cost them everything. Eve, the mother of mankind, would complete the story in her own way. She would teach the girls the preciousness of life and the joy and responsibility of motherhood. She would stroke her children's heads, her eyes filled with endless love and sorrow, reminding them to be wary of their selfish desires. For she knew better than anyone that a tiny gap could bring the world crashing down. She would reiterate God's promise, becoming offspring who was their only hope. Their teachings were more than just oral history. They taught their children how to observe the movement of the stars, and from this, they saw the Creator's greatness and order. They taught them how to distinguish between clean and unclean animals, perhaps drawing on a vague memory of the harmonious order in the Garden of Eden. Most importantly, they taught them how to build altars and offer sacrifices. Each sacrifice was a public acknowledgement. We are sinful, we need covering, and we rely on God's mercy. When Adam slew the lamb with his own hands, his vision might have been of Abel's pure sacrifice, or perhaps of the first coat of skins God had prepared for them. Through this ritual, he passed down core truths about sin, judgment, and redemption from generation to generation. As time passed, the world grew more complex. People built cities and developed skills, but they also grew increasingly proud and corrupt. Adam and Eve watched all this with a wave of anxiety. They saw Lamech's polygamy and his boastful slaughter, the hardness of human hearts. They saw their own small moment of disobedience, like a stone thrown into a lake, the ripples that had now spread into a mighty wave. They were the source of this sinful world, and the heavy burden of responsibility weighed on them throughout their long lives, unrelieved. Their final years were spent in a tangle of hope and anxiety, gratitude and regret. Their bodies began to age, a state they had never imagined in the Garden of Eden. Adam's gait faded, and he needed a staff to reach the fields where he watched his descendants work with the tools he had invented. Eve's vision faded, but she could still distinguish the laughter and cries of each child by their voices. They often reminisced about the past. They would talk about the shape of a tree in Eden, the scent of a flower, the gentle look of an animal. These memories were both a sweet comfort and a sharp knife, a constant reminder of the paradise they had lost. But their conversations always returned to the promise. They speculated about who the seed of the woman would be, how he would arrive, and how he would bruise the serpent's head. This unresolved hope was the only torch they had for navigating nearly 1,000 years of darkness. When Adam reached the age of 930, he knew his time had come. He gathered Seth and his descendants and told the story that had begun in the Garden of Eden for the last time. Perhaps he held Eve's hand, looking at the partner with whom he had shared his life since Sephard, and hope, his eyes filled with an unspeakable complexity of emotion. As he closed his eyes, perhaps what he thought of was not the fear of death, but trust in the Lord of the promise. He was like a weary farmer who, after a long day's work, could finally lie down to rest and await the dawn. Adam's departure was the final and most devastating blow to Eve. She had lost her creative partner, her husband, her only witness to history. But she was not completely broken. She continued to serve as the head of her family, guarding the revelation and promise from God. The Bible does not record how long she lived, but one can imagine that in her final moments, like Adam, she gathered her descendants to her side, using her final strength to guide them to the coming redemption. Adam and Eve's final years were not an idyll, but a long, arduous, and profoundly meaningful epic. They spent their lives experiencing the consequences of their choices, understanding the price of sin with blood and tears. They went from perfect creations to broken sinners, and from hopeless sinners to believers who held fast to the promise. They buried paradise with their own hands and, atop the ruins, planted the first seeds of faith for their descendants. Their story began with a tragic choice, but ended with a gesture pointing toward eternal hope. They closed their earthly eyes, but their souls awaited the eventual arrival of the seed of the woman, who would reopen the path to the tree of life for them and for all who would believe in him. Their lives are a condensed history of humanity, created by God's grace, fallen through their own disobedience, struggling in toil and sorrow, and ultimately resting in the hope of redemption. They were the first parents, the first sinners, and the first believers to receive grace. Their final years paint a true and profound picture of life for all who come after them. Even in the long night after being expelled from the Garden of Eden, there is always a star called Promise, shining tirelessly in the distant sky for all who look upon it. If today's sharing has given you new insights into life loss and hope, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. More importantly, please share this profound story of humanity's first parents with those around you, because in their story, each of us can find reflections of ourselves.